So welcome everybody, if you've just joined us. Welcome to this webinar, What Just Happened, looking at the experiences and what we've heard from people in various different ways about how the pandemic and the restrictions around that has affected, in particular, faith and church life within Scotland. I should explain, I'm Fiona Tweedy. I'm not Steve Aisthorpe. Unfortunately, Steve has a family medical emergency. He's not able to be with us, but assures us of his prayers and has given me a pile of notes for what he would have said. So we were supposed to hear from Steve in the listening project. I was going to speak about the Adapt and Be Flexible report, but we're switching around. I will be speaking about the listening project, and I'm delighted to welcome Liam Fraser, Minister in Linlithgow, who was one of the co-authors in the Brendan Research Adapt and Be Flexible report. So he will be speaking about that, and I will be speaking about the listening project. So Liam and I will present the main findings. Our panel will help us reflect on that, and then there'll be some questions and answers at the end. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat, and Karen will be looking at them and will be asking our panel hopefully the majority of the questions. We do want to finish at 1:30 for that. As we have said, this session will be recorded. You're welcome to turn off your camera if you want to eat your lunch or anything else. Please go ahead and do that. And questions will be asked through the chat, so we're not expecting live things there, but be aware that we are recording this and we'll make it available afterwards. So I'll start with introducing our panelists. Liam, can you tell us something about who you are and maybe how the pandemic has affected your situation?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Fiona. I'm very sorry that Steve couldn't be here today, but I'm very pleased to be your stunt double for this webinar. So thank you for inviting me. So I'm Lim Fraser. I'm the Minister of St Michael's Parish Church, Linlithgow. I'm convener of the Church of Scotland's Theological Forum and the co-author of the report, which we'll be hearing about later on. And in terms of my own context, obviously I was only about 3 or 4 months into my first parish when the pandemic hit, so it was quite a whirlwind of activity. And like many of the people on this webinar today, we ended up coordinating Linlithgow's response to the COVID crisis, delivering food and medication and so forth, and offering emotional support to people. So it was a huge amount of administration to try and set all that up and actually deliver it. And the biggest thing for me, I think, in terms of impact has been the pastoral side of things, that, funerals, bereavement care, people who are close to death, all of those things have been disrupted, and people have not been able to receive the care which, I hoped I would have been able to give them, which is very, very sad. But so that was probably the biggest impact for me. And I think for me now, it's just a matter of looking to the future and seeing what can we learn from this period, what has God been doing through it, and how can we as a united church in Scotland move forward and implement changes that will actually serve and reach people better than perhaps we did before.
That's great. Thank you very much, Liam. We have 3 panelists with us today. Our first is Dave Kendall. Dave, can I ask you to say again a couple of minutes who you are, where you are, and how the pandemic has affected you?
Certainly. Afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm Dave Kendall, the Chief Officer. I'm based in Edinburgh. We're currently sitting in East Kilbride, and I've been in post since November 2019, which means something like 15 months of my almost 20 months in post have been during the pandemic. So it's very much had an impact on me. I'm the very first Chief Officer, so I thought it might be helpful just to describe a little about what I do. So when I talk about my experience later, you'll get it in context. My reporting route is to the Assembly trustees, who I'm sure you will all recognise have an extremely challenging task, which they carry out with real faith, passion, diligence, professionalism and skill, because I see this all the time. The focus of my role is to support them in implementing the strategic objectives of the General Assembly, striving for excellent operational delivery, and doing our very best to equip and support the presbyteries and local congregations, devolving responsibility wherever possible. I'm responsible for employees, budgets, finance and organisational implementation from a national office perspective. And as you'll imagine, much of my time is focused on how best to support local need, working with the principal clerk, presbyteries and congregations. And I also work closely with general trustees and Crossreach. So you can imagine just how much impact the pandemic has had across all of these areas. And the scope of my role includes the Faith Action Programme, that's the work of the Faith Nurture and Faith Impact Forums, and the service departments, health and safety, finance, human resources, law, communications, information tech and facilities. My interest in the listening project stems back to when Steve Aisforth proposed the idea to me. My experience tells me that listening and acting on feedback is one of the most important things that we need to do. In the past, I've seen the very positive impact of effective use of data and surveys in terms of supporting understanding and focused improvements. There's no doubt we've been in a very unique situation for the last year and a half, and we've learned so much and can really build on this as we strive to address the long-term challenges that the church faces. The outcomes of surveys like this can be very challenging and will at times make uncomfortable reading. But we know we have to be positive and open-minded in terms of how we react to what we hear. And finally, I did recognise many of the themes from the work, and this was at a number of levels. Whilst I may be the chief officer, I'm also an elder, a worship leader and a church member. I do know and understand what it felt like in a congregation and how hard this last period has been. I've joined worship online, I've prepared pre-recorded services, I've preached in a church to small numbers of silent masked church members. I've missed my church family. I've intently studied our local as well as national financial accounts. And today I'm very much looking forward to hearing people's reflections and challenges on the messages from the Listening Project. Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to pass over to Liam.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Fiona. I'd now like to introduce our next panellist, Carolyn Merry, and wonder if you could say a wee bit about yourself and what your experience has been.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. My name's Carolyn Murray. I'm the Director for Place for Hope, which some of you may know is a charity based in Scotland that works with individuals and churches to be equipped to achieve their potential as peacemakers in our local churches and in our local communities. It was interesting reflecting on this pandemic, because my background is mainly in working in international circles, mainly in war zones and countries and regions in crises. So that has actually informed so much of my experience of this pandemic. When I started the pandemic, I was CEO of a charity based out of Birmingham, working across the UK, working with young people in deprived neighbourhoods from different faiths, bringing them together to be able to work on peace together, and working with a team spread out in very different circumstances to support young people was a challenge, and like all of us, rising to that challenge. And then 1 year today, Muriel, I was interviewed for the role that I'm currently in and switched a job. And it was only a week ago that I actually met the team that I have been working with for the last 10 months. And I feel very privileged to be working with Place for Hope in the work that we do on peace and conflict transformation and helping people to navigate through change and conflict well. On a personal level, as you can tell from my voice, I grew up in Australia. I am set here in the West Midlands running a charity, living by myself, was not in a bubble for most of it. And so the personal impact of COVID pandemic has been lived out quite differently. I started it with my mindset that I would do in any country in crises, very much the observer, the medical advisor. And it was only a couple of months into the pandemic, I recognised that what I was telling people, the signs to watch out for, was I was also experiencing. I was a participant in this crisis and needed to recognise that myself. And I think we all do, whatever role we play within our churches, within our personal lives, we have been impacted one way or another. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. I'd now like to pass back to Fiona, who we heard a wee bit from earlier on, but she's going to tell us a bit more about her biography and her experiences of the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, Liam. I'm Fiona Tweedy. I have at least a dual role in part of this. I'm a statistician. I work with the Church of Scotland for 2 days a week as part of the research and analysis team that we have. And the rest of the time, I have a research consultancy called Brendan Research. And I just started that actually just in mid-pandemic. So a number of us, people I work with, I've never actually met. But what I think what I care about most is telling stories and hearing what's going on in different ways, whether that's through numbers and statistics, or whether it's through stories, and being able to bring these things into the light so that we can hear them, and particularly marginalised groups or people that we don't hear from so often. So when the pandemic started, part of what I wanted to do was to listen and share the experiences and find out. Maybe I'm just nosy. Find out what is going on and share those experiences with people in a way that is honouring to their experiences and helps everybody and communicates them well. Helps everyone to understand. So some people are asking, I'm standing in for Steve Aisthorpe today. I'll be speaking about the Listening Project, and Liam is one of my co-authors on the Ecumenical Brendan Research Report. We'll be speaking about that, so we are kind of switching over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that. And lastly, Muriel Pearson, you could say a wee bit about yourself and about your experiences.
Hello, everyone. I'm very conscious that everybody's experience has been unique, even as we've also shared experience. So I'm a parish minister in the East End of Glasgow in a priority area in Cranhill. I'm single. I've lived alone throughout the pandemic. I wasn't in a bubble. So quite a lot of isolation and working remotely and trying to care pastorally remotely, as Liam was saying earlier. But I'm also aware that many other colleagues were dealing with homeschooling or were shielding. And so today I'm not really seeking to represent anyone other than myself. You know, my COVID experience so far has been uniquely mine, and yet there's lots of shared experience. Unlike Liam, I did not get drawn into a kind of local response, because Cranhill Development Trust, which is based in our church building, went into mega response. And in fact, they wanted the staff team there didn't want our participation as congregation. However, the family worker was furloughed very early on, and she works with very vulnerable families, mostly asylum seekers and refugees. So I was doing quite a lot of going round them. So my experience was a kind of mixture of isolation and then real encounter, you know, in a funeral situation or on a doorstep or whatever. So quite a mixed experience. And looking back on the lockdown seems an awful long time ago. However, I'm sure that those experiences are continuing to live with me, and that we still need to process so much going forward. One of my questions right at the beginning, I remember asking Glasgow Presbytery on the last face-to-face Presbytery meeting we had, is who's doing the theology here? There was a lot of chat about hand washing and to mask or not to mask, and how we were going to practically deal with the pandemic. But my question is, where's God in all this? What's the theology? And that's the question I've kind of been asking throughout. I was then asked to join the steering group for the listening conversation, and I tried very hard to get out of being on this panel today, but Steve wouldn't let me. So that's who I am and why I'm here.
Thank you very much, Muriel. Thank you for allowing yourself to be bullied by Steve, possibly, and we value your time and what you have to say. So in terms of the projects that we're speaking about in this webinar, I'm going to ask Liam to say a little bit about the Brendan research report, Adapt and Be Flexible. How was it done? So something about the methodology, and then we'll hear about the results in a little bit. Liam.
That's great, Fiona. Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen now to pull the slides up. Can everyone see the screen, the slides?
Looks fine, Liam. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
So this research came about because of an approach we made towards the Scottish Church Leaders Forum about the need to try and, first of all, get a snapshot of the pandemic and the experience of the churches in the midst of it, but also to try and do what Muriel's saying, to try and make some first attempts to try and understand a little bit about what God might be doing. And therefore, the Scottish Church Leaders Forum then approached ACTS in collaboration with ourselves, and then we were commissioned by them to produce this report, Adapt and Be Flexible. The mission doesn't stop. And we spent a long time thinking about what logo, what a title to have for the actual report. But this seemed to sum up, the experience of the church leaders we surveyed. That we had to change, we had to be flexible, because at the end of the day, people needed us, and God was doing something. We need to be present and serve Him and to serve our neighbours as best we could. So the authors of the report were Fiona Tweedy, who we've met, myself, and Sheila Akamaya-Conte, who I'm not sure is here today or not, but she was the third author. And in terms of methodology, I'll just give a quick run through of this. It was an online mixed method survey, which means that we put a survey out on SurveyMonkey, and we asked people different kinds of questions. Some of the questions were to try and put a number to quantify the different projects, the different viewers, the different things that we're doing, to put a number on it. And other things were about the experiences, the stories, the feelings of church leaders. So there was a quantitative and a qualitative element to this, to try and get an overall picture of both what people were doing, how much of it, but also what they were feeling and experiencing. And it covered this kind of two distinct periods. The first lockdown period, running from March 2020, so for that part there, but then also the post-lockdown period, after those major restrictions during the first period started to be relaxed. And that was quite intentional. We wanted to see the immediate effect of the lockdown and the pandemic on churches during that first kind of hectic period, and then to see what came back afterward, a kind of before and after shot, and to see what recovered and how quickly things recovered after those restrictions started to ease. And we looked at a whole variety of different things. In terms of church life, we looked at worship, the pivot, as we'll call it, to online worship, what the churches were doing to serve their communities during the pandemic and lockdown, and also pastoral care, which we've heard a wee bit already. But we weren't just interested in what people were doing, what church leaders were doing. We were interested in them themselves. We were interested in their stress levels, what they were feeling, what their views about the pandemic and lockdown were, and also what they thought God was doing through it. And we'll come on to that later on, because that's really crucial here, I think. And we also looked about the different kinds of area we worked in. We already heard there from Muriel about priority areas. We looked at different kinds of area in the country, different kinds of community, in terms of deprivation or wealth, and also in terms of ethnicity, to see if there was any differences there. And as Fiona's already said, this was an ecumenical undertaking. There were ecumenical bodies that suggested it, ecumenical bodies that funded it, and ecumenical church leaders who were asked. And we put out the survey to 50 different leaders from 50 different denominations. And some of them were invited through the Church Leaders Forum, and that was kind of the main way in which we did it. But we also just actually sent emails to people, Sheila Akamaya-Conte in particular, trying to reach churches which are not always part of the kind of ecumenical instruments that many of us are familiar with. And so in the end, we got 369 responses, which is a good cross-section of the different denominations in Scotland. 27 were represented, all of the kind of the main denominations that we're familiar with, Roman Catholic Church, Church of Scotland, Episcopal Church, Free Church, Baptist, etc., Salvation Army, but also a number of smaller churches and denominations, and some as well from an ethnic minority background, which was important. We had responses from every council area, which was good. So we up in Shetland and Orkney, right down to Galloway and Dumfries and the borders. So everyone had some say in this. As you can see from the little graph there were a good cross-section of different SIMD deciles. So that's the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, so different forms of deprivation or wealth in the country. And also a fairly good age and gender spread. As you'll see from the little chart down the bottom there, there is a difference in terms of gender, but that's reflective of the fact that many denominations only have male clergy or male church leaders. So that's why there's a skewing there. But taking that into consideration, we were fairly happy with the results we did. So this was an ecumenical, multi-method online survey, and you'll hear more about the results later on. And and I'm going to ask you, Fiona, as one of the participants in the listening project. What did you do in terms of methodology? Who did you hear from, and what was done, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. So the listening project was designed as a complementary project to the ecumenical report. We knew in other places people were being inundated with this survey and that survey and the next thing. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't have that kind of situation in Scotland so much. And when Steve Asthorpe proposed this, it seemed like a great way to get a different view, a different facet of what was going on. So the listening project itself was a qualitative project. We asked people to write things. We did ask them some information about their gender, about their involvement in the Church of Scotland, but it was done as a textual responses to hear people's own words about what they said. And we asked anybody involved within the Church of Scotland. So it was within the Church of Scotland, not wider than that, but we did ask everybody at all levels of the church if they were members, if they came along to some things, and getting that prospective hearing from everybody's experience of the pandemic. And as Liam has said, the Brendan Research Report looked at the first lockdown, which, as people have said, seems so long ago now, and then that immediate period afterwards where we could open up a little bit. So it was looking then, whereas the listening project, we ran it from November towards February. So again, I think closing down and through the winter. So a different experience. But we tried to complement the other pieces of research that were going on. And we also, that was a qualitative report. We also asked quantitative questions through the Church of Scotland congregational statistics that would be asked of session clerks and elders. So we had 3 different things going on, trying not to overburden the same people with demands for information, but giving different people a chance to express their experiences in the different ways. So Liam, we've heard a little bit about how the Brendan Research report was set up. Can you give us a quick rundown of the results, please?
Of course, just let's get the slides back up. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, you're good.
Excellent, superb. So the kind of headline, which we're all very familiar with, is this pivot to online worship. We found out that prior to the lockdown and the pandemic, only 18% of church leaders were offering some kind of online offering, in terms of pre-recorded, live stream, interactive, etc. But then, as you can see from this graph, there was a huge upturn in online worship for obvious reasons, and almost everybody, 96%, almost everyone that we surveyed was offering some kind of online worship, at least occasionally during the pandemic. And crucially, and this is the important bit for the future, 82% of church leaders plan to continue. And that's very, very important because that's a massive sea change in how the church in Scotland delivers ministry and mission. if that proportion of people are going to continue doing this and allowing people to engage in worship and engage in church life in a different way, in an online way. 92% at least once a week. So that was most people overwhelmingly did it once a week. And this came back to something that Dave said earlier on. We found that actually 42% of church leaders were really doing this all by themselves. I mean, they really had like almost no help whatsoever. The majority did have help, which was good, but actually 42% really had really nothing. And that's kind of worrying in terms of workload and stress and competency and all sorts of other different things. And we'll touch upon that later on too. In terms of the voices from this, people on the whole were very, very positive about the opportunities that came from online worship. It's given people a massive step forward, we read here, but it's also highlighted some downsides. The digital divide between ages or demographics. And also there's a recognition too that while there was great opportunities in terms of new styles of worship, new forms of liturgy, etc., there was also serious drawbacks, and some people reflected on the need for a physical embodied community. Obviously in terms of the sacraments, and we might touch upon the sacraments later on, but simply being in a room with other people in physical space-time. So there was a recognition that this was not ideal, and this was not the only offering the church really should make. So one of the recommendations we had, very briefly, was that online worship really is here to stay. That was the overwhelming response we received, and it has to be adequately resourced. We can't have situations where people are doing everything by themselves with no training. That's just not a suitable way forward. So it has to be properly resourced and trained. But crucially, coming back to what Muriel was saying, we have to adequately reflect upon what's happened. We had to reflect upon the balance between local congregational online worship and kind of national or centre delivered forms of online worship. And we need to look at the balance between online and in person, and that needs to be reflected upon theologically. And we come to the conclusion later on that we really need to do that ecumenically, because actually no denomination has a fully worked out theology of online worship. We're all just kind of stumbling around in the dark to some extent with this. And we need to have those conversations together and support each other, not just doing it in denominational silos, which, as online worship shows, are completely defunct now. People are tuning into every conceivable type of denomination and liturgy, and therefore there's no reason why we can't do that together. We looked at community service, what churches are doing to serve people in their communities. And we found an amazing statistic that on average, the average congregation in Scotland offers something like 3.6 activities that benefit the local community. I mean, that's a staggering number, because when you extrapolate that up to all the congregations in Scotland, it means something like up to 12,000 projects are in operation across the Scottish Church to benefit Scotland and benefit Scots. And that's something we don't maybe reflect on enough, the huge difference we make to society, but something we don't articulate enough to policymakers, local government, and to wider society. But obviously, as you can see from the chart, there was a massive reduction in the amount of activities going on during lockdown. There was a 43% fall in forms of community service during lockdown. However, we did find that 51% of church leaders were actually helping more people. So they might have fewer activities, but they were helping more people, which is good, slight majority. And 26% of church leaders increased the number of activities. So about a quarter increased the number of things they were doing. But the thing we were most kind of worried about was this, the youth and families element. You can see there's a massive reduction in parent and child and young people and children ministries. And they did not recover as quickly as we would have hoped after the first lockdown. And that's unfortunate insofar as some of the greatest burdens were placed upon families who were having to homeschool and look after people at home by themselves, and often with single parent families. So that's a big problem for the church and for society. We can see here that one church leader said that their church members had been activated, had been brought alive. They've been switched on in serving their city in partnership with NHS and local council, as well as serving in food banks and helping to make calls to the vulnerable. And one church leader reported that their children and families worker paid socially distanced visits to over 150 households. I mean, that's an astonishing statistic, and would be repeated in other parts of the country too in similar ways. So we think one of the things that came out of the report too was that a lot of this, as you can see from the first quote, was done in partnership. And partnerships are a really key thing we discovered, that when people had partnerships with the council, with local charities, with other churches, crucially, they could do more and better mission. So partnership enables more and better mission. And we need to understand that more. What makes for good partnership, what makes it possible, and what hinders partnership. Because if that's really the case, that partnership gives you more and better mission, we need to understand what stops that from happening. So we need to further research into all this, and also the social capital generated by churches.
Liam, can I encourage you to be drawing this to a close? That's
fine. We've already heard about pastoral care, about loneliness, bereavement, and so forth, which we've heard from myself and Muriel. We've heard about some of the things which church leaders did in terms of making calls, sending cards, delivering things, but also how difficult it was in terms of pastoral care and how cold it sometimes felt. In terms of church leaders, we found that church leaders were, on the whole, finding ministry more stressful, 63%. They felt guilty and not doing enough. They felt stressed about new skills, learning that, uncertainty, and balancing work-life balance. But thankfully, 88% felt supported by their denomination, which is important. And we talked about various blessings and so forth. In terms of how God has worked, and I am drawing to a close, we found different themes emerging from the feedback from church leaders. Sabbath, that God had used this as a time of rest and refreshment that came and drawn closer to him, which was good. Enabling authentic Christianity. This is about renewing the church and bringing us back to basics as a people of God. Prompting engagement, we already talked about partnership, reaching out more, being more outward focused, prompting partnership with other churches and organizations, but also an hour of reckoning. The church cutting back, and some congregations finding that this pandemic may have accelerated decline, but also brought out the best in other congregations. And every congregation might have elements of both of that, of pruning, but also of growth. So we shouldn't rush back to pre-lockdown ministry and mission. We need to rethink through this and do things differently in future. And really, I believe that's it.
Thank you very much, Liam. That's really helpful to get an understanding of what's going on in across Scotland ecumenically and in the different congregations, and to see the that mixture, as somebody said in the chat, of qualitative and quantitative data. I'm going to speak a little bit about the listening project. I shall attempt to share my screen. Gosh, everybody disappeared. Is my screen visible just now? Could somebody let me know if it's like? Yeah, thank you. So with the listening project, our aim was to hear directly from people across Scotland and of what their experiences had been. And I think almost the best way of doing that is, as in the report, is to hear the verbatim voices of what people said. And as we've touched on already, a lot of that has been people being forced to shift online, the positives of that, people being able to stay connected from at whatever age. And yet other people who felt that they hadn't been able to be connected, but it's been really interesting to see in our congregational statistics within the Church of Scotland. We asked congregations if they had arranged an alternative offline worship experience. So that may have been through a phone call, maybe perhaps phoning in to a service. It might have been delivering a message or the text of the sermon or the like. And we found that the number of people who'd been able to offer an alternative offline worship was about 2/3. 2/3 of our congregations were offering not just an online alternative with this, but also an offline experience for people as well. So we had a lot of people saying that they were worried about people who weren't connected. But in response, I would say, well, lots of people worked very, very hard to connect other people. And yet some people felt that the presence of the church within their community had disappeared. We might ask what they felt that the presence was. Different people have different expectations of how the church should behave in their community. Some people found the church was very active and had responded in different ways. And yet we also heard from Muriel that a development project had stepped up and the church hadn't been involved at their request. Some people found that the pandemic and its restrictions were a comfortable situation for them, and others didn't. Somebody was saying that they're in a very challenging situation. People were made redundant, people couldn't pay child maintenance, couldn't afford a laptop, and the situation that they were in. So many different experiences. I think that's what came through. It was wonderful that while we had 224 respondents, participants in this, we had 54,000 words that were coded by a set of volunteers and checked by Steve and by Jill Hopkinson, who joined us as a consultant, to find out what the things were, what were the aspects, the themes that ran through all of the work. We were delighted that we got responses from across Scotland. We looked at mapping postcodes to see that we were getting a variety of responses. We had responses from all ages, from oldest to youngest. Not so many in that younger age group. We tried hard to boost that though. We had people who were involved as ministers, as elders, as members, as people who came along occasionally, and all abilities to access the technology. So people who were very familiar, very comfortable with it, but also people who were not. And we had facilitators available to take phone calls to enable people to respond to this project if they couldn't access the online form. The things that came through, the largest, or the theme that was mentioned most often was, of course, about technology. How people were able to engage with their community, with their church community through the technology. Also something about the disadvantages of that as well, the loss of other fellowship. And the other major theme we heard about was about worship, how to worship under the restrictions that were put in place to stop the spread of the COVID-19 disease. We heard lots of wonderful stories about creativity being used by different congregations, but also stories of the pain of not being able to join with the congregation, not being able to sing and worship. People spoke about how they connected in worship through singing. People said their faith was impacted, some positively, some negatively. They felt they'd really lost faith. Other people had used it as an opportunity to grow closer to God. So very much different responses. It's very difficult to try and pull things together for something like this. I can only encourage you to read the full report, to read the voices of the people who took part, and to hear of what was going on at all levels and in all places across the country. Some you will recognise, some you will resonate with, others may seem very alien to you. But I think it reflects that. One thing I found interesting was that one thing that is mentioned less was actually the effects of COVID-19 itself. The stories, the experiences are about isolation, about loss, about new ways of doing things. And that wasn't actually about COVID-19. We're not seeing so many stories about people being personally affected by the illness, but the restrictions that had to be put in place to stop many deaths in the NHS, being overwhelmed and the like. But different stories. I think what I've learned was the importance of not assuming that our situation was a universal one, and the variety of things that were going on, and how people have been able to respond or not. Is that my? Oh, okay. That was my slide. Listen to your people. Keep listening, and the uniqueness of the experience. Take that back. We, I say we ask people, please do, and some people are using it, putting questions in the chat. Can I encourage you to do so? We'll move to some questions and answers in a little while. So please do put questions in the chat as we go through. I'd like to turn to our panelists just now, though. And Carolyn, you said that you have deal with trauma in individuals and communities. Could you tell us something about what you've observed in the trauma that we're going through ourselves at this time, please?
Great, thank you, Fiona. I'm just going to share a screen, hopefully. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that, Carolyn. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, as I introduced myself, and as mentioned, my lens on this and my contribution today is through the lens of the work I've done in many different countries in different crises, whether it's conflict, war, or a health emergency. So I have advised local, regional and national governments on responding to, preparing for and dealing with the aftermath of such emergencies. So that is always going to be, that's what I share with you today is through that lens. I also want to make a point before I get into the COVID situation here, is that the COVID pandemic has not happened in isolation. It's against a backdrop of many different trends that we've seen over time, whether that's around global warming, around social division that we've seen particularly in the public domain of recent decades, politically the move towards populism, fascism, authoritarianism, that has also been a trend. The ongoing situations around discrimination and brutality, whether it's based on ethnicity, on gender, on sexual orientation, whatever it is, those are ongoing situations, as well as poverty and other crises within the COVID crisis. We've got a backdrop of terrorism, and against several decades of improvement in violence and decrease in wars around the world, we had, leading up to the pandemic, an increase in terrorism and more widespread violence. And also for churches themselves, the trends of different demographics in the communities in which they exist, and the challenges and opportunities in that, in decreasing numbers for some churches and resource challenges, and grappling with issues that the community sort of underpins, whether it's around sexual orientation or same-sex marriage, those sorts of larger issues that the church is grappling with. Overall, prior to even getting to the pandemic, there were these trends that made us feel that we were sort of on in this picture here, a sinkhole, but not on solid ground, or in terms of a parable, building on solid rock. And so I do want to put it against that, because the pandemic played out, highlighted and exacerbated those divisions and those trends, and we experienced the pandemic through some of those. Now, I've spent my life, half my life, and certainly most of my adult life in humanitarian and international peace building. And this diagram from the Episcopal Relief and Development Fund summarizes so much of what individually we can experience in terms of emotional trauma and experiences throughout an external crisis. So we know that, early in 2020, we were starting to hear about this new virus in China, but it didn't really impact us until it came to the UK. We had our first lockdown, and most people did what people do in acute crises. We rose to the challenge of it. We sacrificed our freedoms, and we cared for one another. We were grateful for those on the front lines. There was a sense of community cohesion. And then over time, we switched from being an acute crisis to a chronic crisis. And there was a sense of tiredness, of disillusionment. For some people, that was sort of late autumn last year. For some, it was around Christmas. But over that winter period, we had 70,000 people in the UK die from COVID over a 3-month period. We were in another lockdown in shorter amount of hours of daylight in the day. We had some leaders breaking rules that others had kept so strongly at an expense. There was a sense that I'm out of energy, and that often happens between acute and chronic crises. It's a different set of resources, internal resources we need to be resilient in those phases. And now we're coming through a different phase now in terms of working through what I would term as a bit of a roller coaster between hope and despair, and lots of grief of what's been lost, what we're hoping for. There's always signs of, okay, things are improving, and then something happens. And it's that roller coaster that we're on. So from the lessons I've learned from other situations of national crisis, and remembering that when we're dealing, everybody's, and it's been expressed many times in this webinar, is that everybody experiences this differently, depending on your individual, but also what sort of grouping you're in terms of your ethnicity, in terms of your living circumstances, in terms of the job you have. But trauma on a national level, you cannot deal with every individual person. And that's one of the frustrations of providing mental health care and physical care in such situations. You have to look at the broad situation. And so some of the things I've learned is that as we start to return to the freedoms that we are so welcome, they are sometimes also overwhelming. There's an array of choices that we haven't had for a while. We're trying to work out what's safe, what's not, for ourselves, for others, and it's tiring. We're coming through and continuing in a chronic crisis phase. We are exhausted anyway as a backdrop to those freedoms. And people will return and emerge from the pandemic when it eventually ends at different rates. And we need to understand that people will take different lengths of time. Some will just jump into, great, everything's the way I want it now. And others will take a lot longer. One of the things I've learned again and again is the absolute importance of acknowledging and honouring our different experiences of the pandemic, which have been spoken about. And to do that helps us to heal collectively and to move forward collectively. And the other thing I'd say about this is that we do this partially as we continue through a crisis, but until a threat has completely gone, it's very hard to do it fully. And we may find ways collectively as church communities, civic communities, to do that in public spaces, in murals, in time capsules, in religious services, in whatever ways we find that's right for our community. But to be able to understand that people have non-experienced this differently. Some people have lost several members of their family. Some have, just been broken through the isolation that they've experienced, while others have, on the surface, had a relatively comfortable breeze through this, but have not been able to follow up in terms of roles. They've been made redundant, as we've seen from the research has just been shown us. Now, we've asked ourselves, and we can see it every day, people asking what will change in the world because of this pandemic. But I wonder whether the question is, how will we be changed coming out of the pandemic? Often the disconnect after a crisis has happened, especially a chronic one, is that the world that we once inhabited without much thought feels disconnected to us. There's a jarring, and that's not because the world has changed, but because we have been changed through the experiences we've had, and it's acknowledging those. Mental health and well-being, as we've heard, and we all know, and positively has been spoken about quite a lot during the pandemic, has been impacted greatly. And we know that the restrictions, as well as the life and death threat of the pandemic, has impacted that, particularly for certain groups like young people, people in isolation, people who've been shielding. But one of the other lessons I've learned through working in such crises is that often that is true, but people persevere. People have enormous resilience. And although their mental health's impacted, they just keep going for the most part. And we help people along that aren't. But afterwards, we expect that once we're back to the places that we want to be, seeing people we want to be seeing and hugging and so forth, that we will just feel better. And often that is not the case. We will be feeling the emotions of unprocessed experiences for quite a while, and we may feel, well, why am I not feeling better? Is it me that's a failure? But in fact, it's just the ongoing effects of a crisis that has changed and impacted you. And we must be aware that as we come out of the pandemic, eventually when we do, that increase in mental health issues and well-being that will be felt. And I'm just coming to the end, if that was a reminder. The last one is about social unrest. And I bring this up because I think we do have a role as a church in being proactive about this. You know, the poverty divisions that were in this country before have all been increased. There's more poverty, there's more homelessness, there's more joblessness, there's more families seeking support for food banks. We have a lot of young people who feel that there's no future for them, no jobs, education has been affected. We can expect that on the streets of our towns and cities there will be more social unrest. And we can be proactive about the underlying causes of that. So in terms of just finishing that off then, that is all very bleak in some ways. But I also, coming back to Muriel's question, where is God in this? God doesn't cause this, but he's been with us throughout this. And I think there's also a Kairos opportunity, a time for godly transformation, where we can create space for people coming out of this at different speeds, of being able to provide spaces for storytelling and processing, of acknowledging and honouring, and for finding those new shared visions in our church and civic communities of God's leading, of the lessons we've learned through this pandemic. And because of those global trends that are continuing, to create spaces and equipping our churches to deepen its ability to notice brokenness and division, to nurture relationships and community, to navigate change and conflict well and with graciousness, and to nourish wholeness and in ourselves and in our communities once again. And I'll just leave you with these words from a prayer from the Corrymeela community. Where there is separation, there is pain. And where there is pain, there is story. And where there is story, there is understanding and misunderstanding, listening and not listening. May we, separated peoples, estranged strangers, unfriended families and divided communities, turn toward each other and turn toward our stories with understanding and listening, with argument and acceptance, with challenge, change, and consolation, because if God is to be found, God will be found in the space between. Amen. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for that presentation, and for commenting how helpful they found the emotional life cycle of disaster, showing different stages of trauma that people have encountered both as individuals but also as communities. So we're running a wee bit short of time now, and so if we could ask now Dave Kendall to speak about his experiences and perspectives as a senior decision maker for a few minutes, and then we'll turn to Muriel. So just a few minutes, Dave, about your experiences.
No problem, Liam. I'll give you just a few minutes. I'm not going to overlap with what's already been spoken about. As I've already mentioned, one of the most important aspects of any survey or learning process is what we take away from it and either follow through with appropriate actions or incorporate the insights into the forward programme. Not everything we hear has to be acted on or will be representative of the broader consensus, so judgment of what is accurate, urgent and important does come into this. The pandemic has impacted hugely on my role and on the role of the people who work with me, as it has for everyone else. We found ourselves having to work from home with all this entails, particularly looking after each other. We faced decisions on furlough. We had to progress the improvement plan, cost reduction targets and resource challenges while working remote from each other. We had to find new ways of communicating. We had to provide consistent advice on how to continue to worship and be church in a very different world. It's been a very challenging time for everyone, with us all missing family, fellowship and colleagues, with much heartbreak and sadness along the way. However, this situation has in some ways brought our long-standing challenges as a church to a head. And we've taken action at a pace that was probably previously unthinkable. The passion for our church, the innovation and the willingness to think differently that I have seen in dealing with the pandemic has hugely encouraged me. Some of the messages from the Listening Project and broader research in this area really resonated with me and in many ways reinforced the important actions we already have to take or are planning, whilst also raising others for consideration. So since I started in my role, I've had a strong focus on listening and engagement. I try to speak to as many people that contact me as I possibly can, and I've heard many of the messages from the project before, whether they be good, bad or mixed. As a church, we've got still to be entirely clear about the vision of how we will relay the message of gospel in the new world we're living in. We need to find a way of articulating this to everyone inside and outside the church so that we have greater clarity on the future goal that we're working towards. And there's no doubt that this will need to be flexible and take on board our wonderful history and the potential for innovation in the future. There's also a link for me for the work that we've been doing on behaviours, values, coaching and accountability as part of our journey. How we care for each other and look after each other in this very challenging time and what comes from it. And the pandemic for me has also reinforced the need for a continued clear focus on health, safety, welfare and communications. Returning to more normal working arrangements post-COVID-19 and establishing new ways of working, striking the right balance for the future and determining what this means. For example, what will our future office needs be as we move forward? It has accelerated the need for us to address the financial situation of the national church, prioritising what we do, adhering to budgets, close control of expenditure, further savings and cost reductions are inevitable. The operational model that we've created for our scenarios is helping to inform us for the future. So all of the data we're collecting is really important. And things like governance of reserves, including future planning of how we manage our money. And we also recognise the need to support congregational sustainability and income generation, which is a really sharp focus for our financial team. And I received messages from the Listening Project on the National Office, and it confirms that we need to continue our hard work on improving relationships and networks across the church, in particular with presbyteries, ministry and local congregations. We need to deliver our plans in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible with consideration of the appropriate use of our staff in doing it. And we continue to focus our national office staff on the local need through consultation with presbytery congregations and others. The feedback loop also supports the need for the national office grants approach that we're taking on Small Grants Fund, Pioneer in future, which came through at the 2021 General Assembly. And all of this needs to be done with us all working together. There were messages in the survey about young people as well, and they weren't all positive. We need to align with the thinking around new ways of being church with a focus on intergenerational worship for all, but including a specific focus on children, young people and young adults. There's a clear need for a focus on information technology as a major enabler for the future. We've learned so much during the pandemic at every level of the church, but particularly locally. And much of this is underpinned by some major projects such as presbytery reform and presbytery planning to deliver a missional, affordable, sustainable Church of Scotland for the future. And finally, something else that came through the various surveys that we've done was the importance of inspirational leadership grounded in theology, which has helped to steer us through this very difficult time at all levels of the church and is a major feature of the Faith Action Plan. No doubt our church has played a major role in the community through action and outreach, not just to our membership, but much broader than that. And I think there's a huge recognition of the importance of the church that stemmed from this. So just in closing, these surveys are very, very important, but we have to be careful with them and we have to use them very, very wisely to help steer us on this next path. I'll pass back to Liam.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dave, and I'll then pass back to Fiona.
It is, slightly of a joint cheering. Thank you, Dave, for comments from the Chief Officer's position in the Church of Scotland. We're running a bit behind what we planned to do, but I thought it was important to hear from Carolyn and from Dave and what they're doing. If I can remind you of any questions for the panelists, please do put them in the meeting chat and we'll come to those shortly. But I very much want to hear from Muriel on the experiences and perspectives that you bring. What have you found important from these two projects?
Thanks, Fiona. I guess I was kind of disappointed when I read the listening project report, because I felt that, as you would expect, everything was from a very personal point of view, but it didn't go deep in any way. It all seemed very superficial. And I've also been kind of alarmed by our drive to activism, which I think the findings of the Brendam project kind of shows that we're about doing online worship and about connecting and communicating and giving out food parcels. And I just want to say, whoa, slow the bus. Let's take some time here. And I think that what Carolyn offered us today is a really helpful first taste in the kind of reflection and the kind of connecting to the bigger picture that we need to do. The pandemic has overwhelmed everything, but in a sense, the pandemic is a symptom and not the disease. And if we're doing prophetic, if we're doing a prophetic theology as opposed to just church theology, then we have to keep that in focus. I guess I want to use the rest of my time to read you a poem. It's a poem that comes from the book Doing Theology in the New Normal. It's by a United Church of Christ minister in the US called Karen Georgia Thompson, and it's called For Everyone, ? Writing a new script, inviting the impossible in a world ravaged and changed by diseases, no place safe, no bodies sacred. Bodies shut down by inequalities, gender, race and economy exposed. Attacking the body in every form, disproportionately engaged in an ill-timed assault, ravaging human bodies. Redefining institutional bodies, changing the body of Christ as we know it. Whose new world is emerging? Transforming environments, bringing unscripted change. What to make of this disease? What is the message we hear from this pandemic monstrosity? What are we willing to grieve? What is the message brought by the falling bodies, falling angels, falling morals, falling empathy, falling gods? Whose new world are we imagining? This pandemic teacher has much to say. We learn again to live as Indigenous ancestors. We learn there is more than enough. We learn everything limits and binds. we hear the message that this apocalypse, this moment, is more than mere daily news. Whose new world is defined by this liminality? There is potential. There are possibilities. New worlds are possible among the living, rites of passage identified to be explored. Relocating ourselves in symbols of deeper meeting, we emerge changed, moved to deeper spiritual living. Whose new world is problematized, navigating away from uncaring societies? Whose new world is redefined in this battle for sustainable economics? Whose new world is transformed in seeking to relieve suffering in the streets? Whose new world is emerging?
Well, thank you very much, Muriel, for that question about the prophetic. And about the need to go deep into our experiences, both as individuals, but also as a wider society. And hopefully we'll try and pick up on that a wee bit with regard to the panel and some of the questions that come out, because I think it's important. But on that note, we can now come to the Q&A. And I believe that Karen has been looking at questions in the background and has maybe sent those to Fiona, I believe.
That's right. Karen says she's got lots of drilling work going on outside her house just now and is happy not to be having to relay the questions. We're getting a number of things coming through speaking about Carolyn's insights, and I was delighted to be able to let that run a little bit longer than had initially been suggested. Carolyn, people are asking about your the PowerPoints and the change of slide. Are you happy to share the PowerPoints? Are there other resources that you would recommend for people that they're asking about?
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for the questions. Yes, I can share the PowerPoint. That's fine. And in terms of other resources, I can send them through to you if you want to share them with whoever's registered for the event. That's fine. Yeah. And I think, the sort of three levels we're working on today, isn't it? The individual experiences that we've all had, which are very different, the collective experiences in our communities, such as our church communities, but also that what Muriel so eloquently put, that what world, sort of that global, that God transformational sort of sense of what this can do with us and do to us, and being a part of God's working through this, not because, as I said, and I always reiterate this, not because it's caused by God, but because he's in us, with us, in our suffering, but also our joys as we come out of it. Yeah, but I'm happy to share those.
Great. Thank you. We'll make available the slides, PowerPoints, and Muriel, I'll probably ask you for the reference for the text that you read as well, if you're happy to share that for people who are here. I think I'm hearing what you say, Carolyn, there about being different levels. My background is as a statistician, so I come along with all the numbers and the like, and I always find I'm always terribly impressed and moved by the people who can take those numbers and move beyond them. We do have so many different levels of interaction with this material. Dave, I think you've had the sorry, Muriel, did you want to come in there? No, okay, sorry. We've had some questions about we've been through General Assembly in the Church of Scotland, and we had to make some difficult decisions, and wondering about how we face up to those as a church in seeing the situation that we are in, and trying to minister in our communities as well. Are there people on the panel who'd like to speak about that, Dave? I'm wondering if you have anything you'd like to add or bring in at this point.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Fiona, that we have a range of really challenging tasks to do over the period. But I think what's come across very strongly from today's panel discussions is that this is a hugely multifaceted thing where we must never lose sight of what we are as a church in doing all of it. And thinking forward in the way Muriel and Carolyn have spoken about, and also Liam, it's so important that we do that. And that requires us to work very, very closely together throughout this exercise. It's not something anybody can do. It's not something that from a national office perspective can be done in that way. It's something that as a Presbyterian church, we have to work closely together. We do have to understand, if you like, the boundaries in which we have to try and establish the future, because we will be a different church in terms of, say, our finances and things as we move forward. We know that. And we also know the demographic of our congregations and our ministers dictate certain things we must do urgently to address recruitment to ministry and other things. So we've got some real imperatives which are very tangible. So you talk about people with different backgrounds. My background obviously is from business, and I've been in the power industry for 37 years, and I'm used to those things. I'm so grateful for the wonderful support I get on all the theology and all of the thinking we need to do as a church and how we need to work together. But I'm not saying by any means it's an easy task we have ahead. It's a really challenging one. But I have great optimism from what I have seen from the pandemic work that people have done and the way people have responded and the way the ministers have managed their way through this incredibly challenging time on the ground. And that's why I really am all about what can we do to support the local and what do we need to change in the way we work in the national office to make that even better.
Thank you. Yeah. Liam, I'm wondering, with your role as convener of the Theological Forum, is there anything that you'd like to speak to about this, about the resources perhaps for listening and reflecting?
Yes, I think there's always a danger when you have a crisis, an acute crisis, such as a pandemic, to try and jump into knee-jerk reactions really quickly. And there's no doubt about that. Now, some of that is actually necessary, of course, because actually this was an unprecedented, once-in-a-lifetime, hopefully, event, which none of us were really prepared for at all. And therefore, it's right that we should really be trying very hard to respond to the needs of our communities and congregations at this time. So I think that's completely, and I think Brian Kerr made that point as well, it's just a normal thing that we do. But certainly it's the case that unless we, and this was the first of our recommendations, and really ran through the Brendan Research Report, was really that unless we properly reflect upon everything we're doing, then A, we could do it badly, in the short term, and not serve our communities or congregations adequately. But second, to not learn the lessons from it and therefore not make the changes that God is trying to make. And we talked about prophecy a lot today, and I'll say something in particular about that in a minute. But on the general point about it, prophecy is about speaking from the future. It's not speaking from the past, not speaking just from the present and all the craziness of the moment, but speaking from the future, which is God's future and the one he's bringing into being. And really, I don't think we can do that prophetic dialogue, thinking, articulation, speaking, just by ourselves as individuals or as congregations or just as denominations, but as a whole church. And that was something that Lorna, I believe, raised in the point there about the ecumenical aspect of this. So to me, in terms of practical way forwards with this, we can also look at the different resources that will be circulated after this meeting today. You can read the reports produced by the Listening Project, Brendan Research, Carolyn's slides and so forth. But I really think the next stage really has to be some actual further events about unpacking the theology of all this. Because it was really, really clear. The overwhelming majority of church leaders were convinced and articulated this very strongly that God was working through this. So we need to tease it far more what kind of new feature he's creating. And I think that can be done maybe through the Church Leaders Forum, through the Scottish Christian Forum, which is coming into being. But can also be done at a local level too. So our local churches in Linlithgow are having a meeting about this in August to talk about what has God been saying to us as Christians in this community, what's he been saying to our community, and how can we then try and make changes and have a different future. So I think it needs to be a national conversation, and this is part of that. But it needs to be local and regional conversations too, which is just about people gathering around, sharing stories and sharing the things we've been sharing today. But particularly the contextualization of that in particular communities is crucial. So I think there needs to be a theological dialogue about all of that. And part of that will be what Muriel and other people were talking about the equalities aspect, and the fact that it's important that in that conversation we don't just ask church leaders or members, but ask the wider community. Just why community auditing and consultation has to be part of this moving forward, to get that contextualization and to hear the voices that aren't normally heard.
Yeah. Thank you, Liam. I think people, thank you for responding to the ecumenical part. I was going to say that it's something that has come through is the way people have worked together at all levels, from the Scottish Church Leaders Forum that kind of came into being around this time, to the work that we've seen reported in the different reports at all levels. And a question from Muriel. I think you also wanted to come in there, Muriel, so I'll ask you to come in to say what you were going to say, and then a question about how do we shift to being more contemplative and reflective, and Carolyn might want to come in on that as well. But Muriel.
I think Liam nearly answered what I was going to say, which was that I think it's really important to listen for who's not in the room, and that God is speaking from the margins and the missing as much as from, in fact, maybe even more than from those who are centrally part of the conversation. In terms of Ruth's question, I mean, I am concerned for colleagues and for congregations who are weary, and I think that we have to give ourselves a bit of a break in expectation, lower our expectations in the next while of what we're going to be able to achieve and do, which is hard when we're faced with the crisis that Dave has talked about, you know, where the crunch in terms of finance and ministry numbers is coming to a head, and we're being asked to produce mission plans and so on. The 5 marks of mission, I think, are really helpful in this. The last 3 of the 5 marks of mission, which are about being engaged with the world and about paying attention to actually the biggest crisis we're all facing is the climate crisis. And we in the church spend so many hours and days and weeks talking to ourselves about ourselves, and that is not going to bring anybody to recognize that Jesus has something to say in our world now. So I think we've got to give ourselves a bit of a break. We've got to keep the wider context in place. And Ruth, you are a spiritual director, and you also do various sorts of counselling. And I would really say to colleagues, tap into the resources that are available to help you reflect and help you rejuvenate and relax and refresh, and to just try to keep that sense of balance in who you are and what you're doing.
I'd just add to that, because you said if I have anything to say, Fiona, just in terms of the phase, I guess, we're in at the moment, where we know, as Liam was saying, we know what was pre-pandemic. We don't know yet what God is leading us to. We are in that awful sort of what we would call in Place for Hope, that transition zone. It's not a place that any of us feel comfortable with. We like to either know one or the other, and having let go of what we had to let go of what was pre-pandemic, but we're not yet at God's vision for us post-pandemic. And so being able to sit collectively and share and dream with God is really important. It feels like we're not doing anything, but in fact sitting in that space with God is where we need to be. So yeah, tuning into those resources, as Muriel would say, but it's an uncomfortable space, and it needs to be for us to listen to God.
Can I just tell a wee story that Carolyn first told me, which comes from Africa? and it's about a young woman who was in a workshop, and they were thinking about the past and the future, just as Carolyn's described, that very uncomfortable transition, liminal place where we all are. And this young woman told people about her grandparents. She said, I've always thought that they'd got it wrong. When I went to school and learned English, the past is behind you and the future is in front of you. But my grandparents always say the past is in front of you and the future is behind you. And the reason for that is you see the past, you know the past, you can reflect on and understand what you've been through. And by drawing on the riches and the resources of that, you can then walk with confidence into the future. And it completely flips the way that we Westerners tend to think about things. But I have just found that so important, and you know, I've shared it with my congregation, who are really enjoying it as well.
Thank you very much.
Into the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is that something I'm wondering? Could Muriel, could you or Carolyn perhaps put that in a slide or a note that we can share with
it's actually from a John Paul Lederach book, so I will share that where that comes from in one.
Well, since I nicked it from you, Carolyn, I think you should share it.
Can I just say I didn't say it was my own. I didn't at the time reference it correctly.
No, you didn't.
That's great. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time just now. I'd like to invite people. Well, first of all, I'd like to ask, before I invite the panelists, for a quick 30-second word or two about how something they've learned or the church should be learning. But Liam, the Brendan Research Report, if people are interested in finding out more about that, can you see where we can get access to that report?
Yes, no, thank you, Fiona. I'm just going to put the link into the chat, which will be the easiest way probably of affecting that. But basically, just go to brendanresearch.com, and if you go to that, there'll be, I think, the top of the page, which you can click on. But this is the direct link here, and there's two different versions of it. There is a summary report for those of you who don't have much time, which gives the key findings and recommendations, and the fuller report, which goes much deeper into the stories and the experiences of people, if people are particularly interested in that.
Thank you. There's also there's a printer-friendly version, because the normal versions are quite dark coloured. We do also have now some printed copies. If you would like a printed copy, please contact Brendan Research for that. Yeah, and in terms of the Listening Project report, the full version is on the Church of Scotland webpage. I don't have the link to hand, but I'll make sure it's shared afterwards. The report is largely the verbatim stories, the responses people have given us. As has been said, they're not always very deep, but they have been what people have been experiencing at the time they responded to that. So much of that report is not technical details or things. Oh, thank you very much, Lynn, for putting that in the link for me. But it's people's stories and their experiences, and a chance to listen to what they have said in their own words. We didn't want to censor anything. We didn't want to get in the way of what people wanted to say. So going back to our panelists, I'm going to go Muriel, Dave, Carolyn. A couple of words to conclude what we've been doing this lunchtime. Muriel.
I think the listening is only just beginning, and that to make spaces to really listen, to deeply listen, to question and support one another in what we're hearing is one of the ways that we will navigate this new future.
Thank you. Dave.
Yes, every day is a learning day, isn't it? That's one thing I think we all have to remember. Every day is, not just during the pandemic, but every day is. And for some reason, I can't see the chat, but my phone has been exploding into action with it. I don't know quite what's going on. But I can assure you that we will listen and we will take on board all that we've heard. And as we move forward together, this is going to be about working together to make sure that we do this, I think Muriel said, at the right pace and get the things as right as we possibly can, in matching up the things we all need to do to achieve the spreading the word of God, is what we're all about. That's all I'll say.
Thanks, Dave. And Carolyn.
And this time I'll be succinct. Is that in those spaces that we create that we've spoken about today, I'll end with the words that was at the end of that prayer that I mentioned before. Because if God is to be found, God will be found in the spaces between. Amen.
Thank you very much for everyone for speaking there. And let's go around and give thanks to everyone concerned. First of all, thank you to Fiona for co-hosting this, and to Steve Aesop too, of course, who was involved in the production of the report, but also in setting this webinar up. And to our panelists, Muriel Pearson, Dave Kendall and Carolyn Merry, for your different insights across different aspects of life and different forms of ministry. And thank you finally to all of you for tuning in today, and for your questions and for your engagement and your continued thinking about all of this. Go away from today not thinking, oh, that was a reasonably interesting seminar, but go away and actually do something in your own communities. Go and speak to people in your congregation, to your ministry teams, to other churches in the area, and see, what has God been saying to us? What is he trying to do? And trying to get a better picture of the new future that he's creating for us as we emerge out of this pandemic and into, a better place that he's creating for us, hopefully. So thank you all to you, and God bless you all.
And thank you to you as well.
Thank you, Liam.
Thanks, Liam.
Thank you.